Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, a very warm welcome to UCL and this conference about the emerging shape of REF in 2028. It feels like a long way away, but trust me, that time will fly when we're having fun. My name is Geraint Rees. I'm the Vice-Provost here at UCL for Research, Innovation and Global Engagement, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here and to welcome everyone who's online. Thank you very much to James and the Research on Research Institute, the Foundation for Science and Technology, and Research England for organising. I think we have a stellar lineup of speakers and panellists, and an equally stellar lineup of people who are going to ask questions. We have a lovely agenda with plenty of time for Q&A, and the most important slide is this one. If you haven't used Slido before, where have you been living for the last 3 years? But please submit your questions using that code, which we shall return to, and you might like to take a photo with your camera if you're a forgetful sort. And those questions will be used by the panelists during the Q&A. So let me also say UCL is really proud to host such an important event. It's in line with our commitment to robust and informed public debate. Note those comments about robust and informed. I hope you're getting warmed up, audience, on matters that are really important, both to our sector and, of course, society as a whole. And what could be more important than the research excellence framework? Rather than being a piece of bureaucracy, I see it as a vital and central part of our UK funding environment for research and innovation. It's trusted worldwide as a gold standard for robust assessment of quality and excellence of our university research sector. And that confidence in that excellence in our research outputs and outcomes, in turn, underpins the confidence of the Treasury and of the public in allocating what are really relatively large amounts of public funding to research. And that underpins all of our careers in the university sector. So it's a really important moment for research and innovation in the UK when changes are proposed to the REF, as they are for the next cycle, which takes us through to submission in 2027 for the assessment in 2028. And this meeting here, therefore, is to discuss, debate, support, and challenge those ideas. And as I've said, we have some outstanding speakers and discussants to do that, as well as you in the audience. And so in the spirit of that debate, and without taking too much time, I wanted to just offer 4 personal reflections on the changes proposed. First is that one big change for me is that research outputs now make up less than 50% of the assessment, 45% to be clear. And that makes space for a significantly increased emphasis on what I would call personally inputs, things like research culture, which are very important. Is that a welcome focus on inputs as well as outputs and outcomes? Or is there a risk that it undermines Treasury consensus that QR is linked to robust demonstration of excellent outputs and outcomes? Second thought, interdisciplinarity is something that we hear about in all of our universities almost every day as the solution to many of the world's great challenges. And of course, UCL, like many other universities, has been doing this for a long time, 15 years in our case. So it's pretty striking that, for me, interdisciplinarity features relatively little in the new REF. Is that because we've got everything right and it's all fine? Or is there a missed opportunity there to perhaps further embed interdisciplinary research more broadly in the REF? Measurement interests me as a third thing. As we move to include important things and inputs like research culture in a future REF, do we have time in the cycle to develop robust ways of measuring that quality that also reflect the diversity of the sector and the challenges that all our individual institutions have? And finally, we're all wanting to reduce bureaucracy, schmureaucracy, but does future REF do enough in this regard? Or are we actually keeping the burden the same or increasing it by introducing new ways to measure things and new and really important things to think about? So those are some of my thoughts. I don't want to suggest there's a simple binary answer to that, far less that I have the answer. But I think collectively, there's room for nuance, for discussion, for feedback on the consultation, and for us as a sector, together with Research England and others, to talk about those issues, because they're vitally important for the future of the REF, which, as I've said, is a central part of research excellence in the UK. So I look forward to hearing the day progress, but we should get on with things now. And so it gives me very great pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable Lord David Willits, Chair of the Foundation for Science and Technology, former Minister for Universities of Science, and the introducer of the first session and Chair of the first panel. David. and I'll hand over the mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geraint. And it's great to be here. And speaking as chair of the Foundation for Science and Technology, we're delighted to be co-chairing, co-hosting this event with UCL and James Wilsden here as well. So it's fantastic to be working together. And this is actually one of the first opportunities we've had to consider the proposals for REF 28. And I have to say, I think that the proposals which we've had, they are bold, they are fresh. And I know from the discussions we've had at the UKRI board, I think they've been very carefully considered. And I think Jessica and her team really do deserve congratulations for such an impressive and useful piece of work. It's an excellent piece of work, but that doesn't mean it is the final word. And it's absolutely clear that there is now a process of consultation that will run until November. And this event is also an opportunity for people to make contributions to that consultation exercise, because there are many key issues still to be resolved. I mean, there's an absolutely clear commitment to equality and diversity, for example. But if you look at the impact assessment, trying to work out exactly what the implications are for equality and diversity, some of the proposals, is already a live topic and itself subject to discussion. Very briefly, because we've got all the key people here who will be talking in a moment. For me, looking back, I always thought when I was the minister responsible in this area, that the paradox of higher education was I actually thought that on the research side, we'd ended up with one of the world's most hyper-competitive individualistic systems. And on the teaching side, we'd ended up with a system that was incredibly weak on offering any information and competitive challenge. And I always thought strategically, we ought to be trying to create a bit more collaboration and cooperation on the research side and a bit more competitive challenge on the teaching side. And I see this important proposal for REF 28 as part of that very desirable rebalancing. Many of the debates on REF have been about percentages, and we can talk about percentages, but I personally think the most interesting feature of the debate so far is the terms. And a bit as in Alice in Wonderland, when we consider these terms, we do have some power to decide what they mean. We don't have, for these terms, when it's not some passive exercise looking up in the Oxford English Dictionary what they mean. They are terms of art that can be defined for the purposes of REF 28. And being clear what we think they mean and wish them to mean is therefore a very useful exercise. And I think all three of the different categories are fascinating. We've got advancing knowledge and understanding, and clearly that means that there are opportunities, for example, to value data and innovative use of data as part of that. For me, as a lay person, sometime trying to draw on expert research, I have always found the kind of synoptic review article an incredibly useful way of learning what's going on in a discipline. But you could argue that in the old REF model, that type of summation did not get the weight that it merited, because you had to show there was something new in it rather than the sheer act of distillation and consolidation itself being a form of adding research value. Will we be able to value that more in the future? Then, of course, there's people, culture, and environment. And we're very aware at UKRI, where we do think about the skills we need to be a successful, highly competitive science superpower, as the term goes. That there was a criticism of the REF that it meant that universities wanted every individual member of the team to be a REF submitting person, and any of the key staff also working, the technicians, some of the data analysts, some of the people helping write the software, if they weren't submitted to the REF, then the university, because of an incentive structure we had created, wasn't so interested in them. This is a real opportunity to get a better balance so that technical roles get due weight. As we all know, those of us who made a pilgrimage to the Cavendish labs, when you see all those cloud chambers, they will say that we got that row of physics prizes a century ago because of the skill of the glass blowers. So to what extent are we celebrating that type of accomplishment in the REF? Can we do better on that in future? And then thirdly, impact and engagement. And we're engagement, and again, another interesting new term. What exactly does that mean, and how will that be measured? So there's a lot for us to discuss today. I hope we'll also get some clues as to where we may be going in the future on metrics. I think and James is one of the great experts on all this, where we, a lot of caution now about crude use of metrics. On the other hand, if you hear George Freeman talking about all the different clusters that excites him, there's a lot of data analysis behind that. Are we properly using and accessing all that data? How can we interpret it to be able to identify research strengths? What will this mean for the global measures of performance of UK research? How does it tie in with those global assessment exercises, including run by organisations independent of any UK public sector? What will they make of it? Are we still going to be finding hidden gems in the way that one of the strengths of the old REF? So let us now set the ball rolling. I think I'm trying to work out the best way of doing this. I think we should invite Jessica up first, and we will sit. Have you got slides, Jessica? Right. Are the slides? Right. Why don't we have all three up? Why don't we have Jessica, Stephen, and Catriona up? And we will have presentations from the three of them, and then we will move on to Peter Gluckman and Elizabeth Gann. So will we? How many seats have we got relative to the number? This is like a cabinet reshuffle. Have we? Right. Well, in that case, I think we can squeeze in Peter as well. And Elizabeth. Right, we're all complete. Right, we have enough. Jessica, over to you. Why don't you set the ball rolling?
Okay, well, wonderful to be here, and also wonderful that we've got so many people who are also watching online, and I know this is going to be recorded, so it's fantastic. There's so much participation in the conversation this morning. I'm just going to give a little bit of a sort of thoughtful background, I think, to why we might have made these changes. And David, you've helpfully outlined quite a lot of them anyway, so I'm not going to go into them in detail. And people have had a chance to look at this in quite some detail. But until last October, I personally was a research active academic at the coalface of national research assessment, actually since it began in my career, spanning now 4 decades. I'm giving my age away here. My first research post as a pre-doctoral early career researcher was in 1986, the year publicly funded universities were required to submit evidence of research performance. And over those years, I personally experienced the shaping effect of this national assessment has actually had on research practice, on the drivers for performance and research careers within universities and beyond, and the shaping of disciplinary practice, and what we value as sort of proxies for research excellence. I've also led disciplinary institutional preparations for research excellence for these national exercises, and sought to influence the design of them along the way, actually with some success. I've taken part in assessment as a panel member in 2014 and 2021. I think you could say, and also led for a whole institution's return at the University of Nottingham. So I think that you could say that I'm a fully signed up member of the referati, which I think we have gathered here today, and it's good to be part of them. And I've experienced the highs, league table peaks, when I was at Southampton and led the return for nursing, midwifery and allied health. We achieved top scores and topped in the league tables for our subjects across the university, which was dominated by science, engineering and medicine at the time. Some of my colleagues from those days are actually here. And it was quite an incredible moment when we were recognised in that university for being that good, which hadn't been thought of perhaps too much before. So, you know, some very good highs, but also some lows, the distorting behaviour, the games and tactics, attribute to it. So it is quite extraordinary, and perhaps I might say divine retribution, that I'm here now having some sort of leadership role with, I would say importantly, the 4 UK funding bodies. It's a co-owned, collectively co-designed and funded exercise. I actually see this as being a once in a generation moment when we have the opportunity to shift in direction. As research assessment has evolved over those decades, so it must evolve again. There are some really, really good things about national research assessment and what it's delivered. And I think the most important thing, which David, you sort of alluded to, is that it's actually provided profound stability for universities and the research system across the UK through the value that's been attributed to dual support funding as a result of the research system and the assessment system. And there are different funding models in England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but they continued with supporting the principle that not all research can be funded through competitive funding schemes, that institutions need to develop their own strategies for research, and that we need a fundamental infrastructure that is discipline agnostic and not subject to short-term priorities. So these successive research assessments have provided that assurance to government as the value of this, and that the return on investment can be seen, as well as insights into the value to the public of that, and impact, and now perhaps some of the engagement elements will be a highly effective lens for that. There's strong evidence, actually, particularly from the early decades when it was a sort of natural experiment before other countries had really got going on this front, that the UK assessment system has probably delivered improved research performance over the decades. And it's actually shifted the way UK institutions worked as they focused on their relative performance. Through the origin, the kind of academic effort being largely self-managed, to a more coordinated and strategically managed approach led by research institutions. It did lead to greater restructuring, greater focus on published outputs, but overall, comparable to other countries, the UK has done extremely well in maintaining and growing its research status globally. So we do need to think about that. It's been highly influential across the globe, with national assessments now widespread, many of them informed by the UK system. And crucially, and perhaps the biggest achievement from my point of view, the one we should be most proud of, it's powerfully driven greater awareness of the exclusionary nature of participation in academic research and the strong relative advantage available to certain groups over others. The grassroots movement that insisted that the REF design should make allowances for maternity leave, for example, had a really, really powerful effect on this being embedded in the management of careers for women more widely across the sector. And I'm very proud that I was one of the voices in that grassroots movement at the time, calling for that change. But the problems are also pretty well rehearsed and not solely attributable to the research assessment system, but they are nonetheless there. So assessment shapes culture, and the impact of this can be traced over a long time. What gets assessed is what gets valued. And there's been a trend perhaps towards an increasingly narrow type of research output, too closely tied to publication metrics and prestige. REF, it's suggested, has perhaps led to maybe some more low-risk research being conducted. I'm not sure about that, but to sort of tie in with what might be thought to be best assessed by panels. We've already heard about hyper-competition, lack of reproducibility and reproducibility fraud actually going on through these publish or perish pressures, not only attributable to REF, but certainly it may not be helping. Unequal recognition of women and others from diverse backgrounds, roles and disciplines, and distortions in institutional practice to secure apparent advantage, and perhaps an anti-collaboration culture that we really want to move beyond. And of course, burden and cost already referred to. So, you know, and importantly, research is changing, and it's changing rapidly, and REF needs to follow that. It's tackling great big problems, it's much more team-based than perhaps in the past, and the scale and complexity of that needs recognising. So, you know, we must bring this shift to address issues. The FRAP programme has taken 2 years to think about that, gathered a lot of evidence, had a fantastically supportive international advisory board represented today by Peter Gluckman. It reflects the priorities for research strategy among the funding bodies, and it sets out these a greater focus on the key purposes. And it has these 2 very important shifts for 2028. A shift in focus from the individual, no census date, no staff list, no managing staff circumstances, complete decoupling of individuals from their outputs, to focused on the institution and what it's nurturing. And a shift from an increasingly narrow focus on research outputs to a much broader conceptualization of what excellence should encompass. We're aiming to reduce burden. We want to talk about that, no doubt, and we're publishing next week a report on costs, and we're aiming to reduce those for 2028 and use systems more effectively, HESA record, maintaining continuity with systems that are at large and so forth, and keeping it familiar but allowing it to evolve. And we've heard about the rebalancing of the various elements of assessment. So we've also made it clear that it's not possible to calculate the funding that might follow. We want to make that very clear to create the optimal REF outcome, because we'll be reviewing the formula as we go and monitoring what unfolds as a result. And we're busy listening to issues and anxieties like today to help with that. And I know there's huge interest, and Stephen's going to talk about some specific elements. Yeah. So it's now our opportunity to engage, and I just want to conclude by saying it is for all of us a generational opportunity. I do believe the world as a whole will be watching this, because it's an opportunity to support the evolution of the global research system, not just ours in the UK. We will be watched elsewhere. The shift in what we value in research, while retaining rigour, started on June the 15th, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jessica. And we've now got Stephen Hill, who, of course, is part of the continuity, stability, accumulated wisdom of the system, having been working on this for a long time. And I'm going to spring this slightly on you, Stephen, but as we're going to get into more detail, and we've got so much coming in on Slido, which is really helpful. I'm going to just mention a couple of the top questions, just because in the hope that in your remarks you're able to include them. The most upvoted at the moment is the following: are outputs portable? Decoupling suggests no. But there are examples of demonstrable links being staff behind staff contracts, suggesting, sorry, this got garbled, suggesting any output produced by them would be eligible. So the portability issue is one. And then there's also another one that's been upvoted a lot, is understanding a little bit more about what engagement means, how separate it is from impact, or it's included within impact. So if you were able in your remarks to touch on the top questions, and I'll keep on tracking what's coming online. Over to you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much, David, and thanks, Jessica, for that introduction as well. It's really great to be here. As others have said, this is a key part in our ongoing conversation, discussion, debate about the future of the REF. And it's been fantastic to have had so much input over such a short period of time. It is only 3 weeks since we published the initial decisions, and it's great to see the debate that it's already stimulating. In the main part of my comments, I'm going to pick up on 2 areas that I'm now delving more into the detail, 2 areas that have been, for me, important areas of debate, and I just want to reflect on those, and then I'll try and pick up those 2 questions that David just passed over as well. So the 2 areas I want to focus on are this question of it's rather technocratic term, decoupling of people from outputs, or to put it more positively, moving the submission process very much to the institutional level and away from the individual level. And then secondly, I want to touch on the people, culture and environment section and some of the thinking around how we might move that forward. So in terms of the shifting away from institutions to individuals, a lot of debate has focused on the removal of maximum and minimum requirements for any individual staff members. So this is indeed a big shift. And the aim of those changes is to really emphasize the fact that we're removing the connections between individuals and the submission, which is an important part of the shift in culture which we're seeking to bring about, and also important for relieving some of the pressures that the REF does bring to bear on individuals, as we know from the comments that we've heard of the comments from Jessica made. Of course, in thinking about this point of having no minimum or maximum requirements, we were very well aware that there were considerable risks in removing those requirements too. Those risks are that universities choose to optimize their submission by focusing resources onto a small portion of their research in order to get to maximize the quality of that research, so that their submission wouldn't necessarily reflect the entirety of what was going on in the unit. And we understand that risk, and that risk was one that we had, I think, trading off, at least in part, against the other benefits of removing this link between individuals and the submission. In terms of thinking about that risk, it's important to look at it in the context of the whole exercise and this focus on people, culture and environment. If we have a submission where all the research that's submitted from a unit is focused on the work of one or two individuals within that unit, that is demonstrably not a productive and effective research culture. And so we need to find ways within the exercise to acknowledge and counteract that pressure by looking at how we measure research culture. In thinking about that, it will be important for institutions to reflect on their outcomes from REF 2021 and the importance of early career researchers in many, many submissions. People who, and we have data on this that we're publishing next week, generally publish or submit fewer outputs into the exercise, but whose contributions are enormously important for the submission as a whole. So I think as institutions think about their strategies, it will be important to reflect on that. But we'll certainly need to think about how we face up to these issues elsewhere in the exercise. We'll need to look at the distribution of authors as a measure of research culture. How many authors are reflected in the output pool? How diverse is that group of authors? Those will be important questions and bits of data that will need to be included and reflected upon. How does the pool of submitted outputs relate to the research strategy of the institution? This is something that we've not done in the past. We've captured information on research strategy in the research environment of REF in the past, but never actually asked the question, does the submitted output pool reflect that research strategy? And I think that's an important new feature that we'll look to include somewhere in the exercise, either in the people, culture and environment element or potentially in the new parts of the contribution to knowledge and understanding. And we'll also be looking at, within people, culture and environment, at how universities are supporting and promoting research within their units, particularly through how early career researchers are supported, again, to enhance the diversity of the research pool. So through those counterbalancing measures, we believe that some of the risks associated with the removal of the minimum and maximum are effectively mitigated and will lead to much more holistic submissions, including in outputs from a range of people within the unit. As an aside, we also need to measure funding, think about funding in this context. And I'm now definitely not speaking with a REF hat on, but speaking very much with a Research England hat on, because this is a matter for the individual funding bodies to consider. but we're definitely not committed to not necessarily using the REF volume measure as our funding volume measure. There are other ways of measuring volume funding that are not necessarily linked to the REF volume measure, and that's something that we're going to be actively exploring in a review of our formula funding, which we announced in our strategic delivery plan earlier in the year. So the second area which I wanted to concentrate on a little bit is around measuring research culture, which again has been a big area of debate since we published the decisions. We still have a lot of work to do on indicators of research culture. We're aware of that, and we're really looking forward to working with you all to develop that. We know there's lots of progress on research culture already in the sector. This has been an important agenda for a number of years now, and through a number of interventions across that UKRI have made, including Research England, we've initiated a lot of progress in this area. And we also know that many universities, in developing action plans around research culture, are developing their own KPIs, their own ways of measuring progress. And we're really interested by that work, and that work needs to very much inform what we're going to do in this aspect of REF 2028. We clearly want to go with the grain in this process, and to learn from what universities are already doing in terms of measuring their progress. And we want to be sensitive to institutional diversity in this space. The research culture challenges for each university will be different, and so their ways of measuring that will also be different. I expect we're heading to something which will have some common expectations in terms of indicators of positive research cultures, but also be sensitive to that the need to tailor that to individual institutional context. I think it's also important to reflect on the fact that change and the direction of change is probably more important than absolute performance when it comes to issues of research culture, or at least we need to look at the change and the direction of change alongside that. So just to wrap up, I'll just turn to the two questions which David pitched in my direction. One around the portability of outputs. I think we've still got work to do on this. The concept of portability is an interesting one in the context of an institutional level assessment. But I think in general, we're open to being permissive in this space, to recognizing that researchers move around between universities, and often the research that they do draws on their time at multiple institutions. So I think we need to think about carefully how we design the guidance in that space, but with an overarching principle of being permissive in the way that we were in REF 2021. And finally, what does engagement mean, and is it separate from impact? Well, I think it works alongside impact. The sorts of activities that we're thinking might be included in engagement is the work that universities and departments do to engage with outside organisations, with businesses, with third sector organisations, with government policymakers, to recognise that work in its own right alongside the outcomes that form part of the impact case studies. And in many cases, impact case studies will contain evidence of engagement already, and we need to think about how that further evidence can be incorporated in the narrative statement that we're proposing. So hopefully I've given you some food for thought there, and also answered those two questions from the audience. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. And I think that hint you dropped on how the funding system might change will also be something of potentially great interest to people. And I think we probably will come back to the wider EDI issues, but that was very helpful, and we've got a lot more coming in on Slido. Now, Sir Peter Gluckman, who of course led the advisory group and whose intellectual influence, I think, on this exercise is very clear. So over to you, Peter, your observations.
Thanks, David. I'm not going to use the slides, so don't turn them on. As you know, the advisory group was advisory, and we didn't really get into implementation details. We focused first on the principles that should exist there, and then when the REF 21 was completed, we started to think about what that might mean in terms of general implementation. I want to say at the outset how impressed I am as an outsider with the officials who have been involved in this process. It's really been a remarkable exercise to work over 2 years. One of them I've never met in person yet, which is Catriona. We've only ever met in 2 dimensions, so it's been interesting. Let me just say, it was out of scope to consider the dual funding model or the relationship to teaching, but I do think that's an issue over time that the university sector as a whole does need to think about, but not now. The problem that we've got in this is because money's linked to it, and I'll come back to that in a moment, you're fundamentally dealing with trying to make as objective as possible something that's inherently subjective. What does research quality mean? What does research excellence mean? It means different things to different people. What does impact mean and to whom? Again, it means different things to different people. What does environment mean? What do engagement mean? They're all inherently subjective terms. Reminds me of beauty's in the eye of the beholder cliche. And yet, because money's involved, we're trying to put a precision about it that is just, and the real issue is the balance between what you consider as fair in distributing money and the amount of effort you put in to try and create a collection of proxies for words that are inherently subjective. And that's the dilemma of the ref. Come back to it in a moment. I think everybody accepts, and certainly our report was quite strong on this, that there's a move away from a narrow and simplistic set of evaluative metrics and indicators that do not satisfactorily capture the quality, utility, integrity, and direction of research. And I think that how one combines qualitative and quantitative measures into the future is going to be something that new technologies and new ways of coming will bring. But we're one step in this REF process towards getting there. I'm not going to talk about all the issues that Jessica's raised, the limitations of peer review, the diversity, gender, career stage issues, the very disparate disciplines that have to be brought into the process, and the essential emergence of boundary-spanning activities. And whatever mechanisms used to distribute money has to take all these things into account. It's bloody difficult to use, and and everybody's trying to see what they get out of it. This whole issue of money is interesting because UK is one of the relatively few jurisdictions, along with New Zealand, that uses a research assessment to distribute money in a dual funding system to universities. And of course, because it's an incentive scheme, as Jessica's again mentioned, the detail of it starts to matter and what it drives in performance. And so part of the issue is how broad a range of proxies and measures should have, how precise they have to be, as I've said before. The other point is the academics themselves have created a lot of the burden. The burden and the cost of this is because people want a precision that cannot be achieved. If you accepted that it's a rough approximation to distribute money, you could reduce the cost a long way, a long, long way. But it's the academics who themselves want to be rated, the way the institutions want to work, that drives the cost. So don't blame the cost only on Research England or anybody else. Much of the cost is driven because academics are used, their egos drive, whether their status and so forth. And I think if you think about the whole bibliometric disease, at least in the scientific community, it's infected academics, funders, employers in a remarkable way, and how we eradicate that disease or create a vaccine to it is interesting. Also, to make the points, academia, research are changing. It's evolving. The world is changing very rapidly, and the REF therefore needs to change in terms of that. We don't have to debate the standing of UK research. It's one of the world's research superpowers. But Brexit, whether we like it or not, has changed the importance of it in a way that makes the exercise going ahead very important. One of our conclusions, which UKRI and the report picks up, and there's a remarkable alignment, as you would imagine, between our report and that of the interim decisions that have been made, has to be to simplify the purposes. Because when the purposes are over-complex, it's confusing for everybody. So clearly the primary purpose is to distribute funds, to provide accountability to the stakeholders, and to ensure that the system remains dynamic, the challenges which British academia must contribute to addressing into the way ahead. The challenges, of course, the REF to date is based on a retrospective assessment of performance to give money to the university as a whole for what it's going to do into the future. And what we were trying to do in our report is try and rebalance that so there was more encouragement for the prospective attitudes, because all said and done, the money goes to the Vice-Chancellor, not to individual departments and units, to think about how the system moves forward. And so I think if you think about that, then from the point of view of everybody, and particularly from the government's point of view, you're really asking three questions. Is the research that is going to be produced likely to be of high quality? Which is a different question to the research that has been produced. Has the institution taken leadership in evolving a strategy to produce quality, impactful and engaged research? And is the institution adaptive to changing times, which comes to the cultural, transdisciplinary issues and so forth, which have already been mentioned? And so you end up asking questions like, how do we make sure that the impact and engagement section is not just about extraordinary impact, the impact from one scientific paper, but is about coherent engagement with policymakers, business, or so forth. How do you actually develop measures and proxies? And that's the challenge for the four institutions, four administrations now. What are the best proxies and how accurate do they have to be? They are the kind of things that are there. Finally, the point that Jessica's almost made is the one that worries me most. That is the REF drive towards conformity that it's used badly. How do we maintain diversity, innovation, and intellectual thought? Because it's that diversity, innovation, and intellectual thought that's most important for both Britain, but for the world as a whole. The one caveat that we put in our report right at the end was, even since we did our work, the world is changing. The emergence of large language models is going to change both the production of research, AI has anyhow, and the reporting of research. And I think there's going to have to be ongoing work in the next year or two to work out how the research system is going to adjust to this changing environment. And then finally, to step in the right direction, you're going to have to look at it again in 2028 and go further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was very useful, Peter. Now, Dr. Elizabeth Gadd, who has played a crucial role, of course, in leading the Advancing Research Assessment exercise. Thank you very much for joining us. Your observations on the proposal.
Thank you so much. I have slides. I'm not sure whether I need to go and operate them or should I stand at the podium?
All right. And meanwhile, the Slido questions keep on coming through. Oh, brilliant. Yes, do you want to give, why don't you go to the podium, Elizabeth, and do it from there. Fantastic.
Fantastic. Okay, you can hear me okay? And you can see the slides, great. So a very good morning to you all. Thank you for inviting me to... I need a mic. I need one of these. Yes? Okay. No clipping is happening. There we go. How's that? Okay, great. So very good morning to you all. Thank you for inviting me today to provide a view from the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment on the REF initial decisions. So for those of you who are unaware, COARA, the Coalition on Advancing Research Assessment, is a 500+ strong international community of stakeholders with a common mission to reform a research assessment in line with the Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment, which was published in July last year. This agreement stands on the shoulders of giants in this space and very briefly consists of 4 core commitments: to recognise a broader diversity of contribution, to abandon inappropriate uses of journal and publication metrics in assessment, both kind of influenced by DORA, to focus primarily on qualitative evaluation, influenced by the Leiden Manifesto, and to avoid using university rankings in research assessment, influenced by some of the INORMS work. But the real beauty of the agreement is that the majority of the commitments relate to actually implementing those first 4 core commitments through allocating resources, developing new assessment approaches, raising awareness of the need for change, engaging in mutual learning, and so on and so forth. And of course, in recognition of the urgency for reform, signatories are invited to create an action plan within 1 year of signing and to report back on their progress by the end of year 5. So how is this all relevant to the initial decisions on REF 2028? Well, Research England is a signatory to the COARA agreement, and the REF Steering Board have situated the design of the next exercise within these international moves towards more responsible modes of research assessment, including COARA. So the question remains, to what extent do those initial decisions actually meet the commitments of that agreement, and where might the challenges lie for the next REF? Well, commitment 1 is this one around recognising more diverse contributions. And of course, the FRAP have been deeply influenced by this aspiration, with the phrase wider contribution appearing 7 times in the initial decisions, yes, I've counted, and not at all in the guidance for REF 2021. So environment has been broadened to include people and culture, and impact has been broadened to include engagement. We now have contribution to knowledge and understanding rather than outputs from research and from a broader range, well, in an effort to solicit a broader range of outputs. So that's all great, tick. But of course, those ambitions are not actually all those different from REF 2021. The difference, of course, is that we now have this range of additional mechanisms to encourage that broader diversity of contributions. So we can now submit outputs from a broader range of individuals, and we have contribution to knowledge statements, as Stephen has described, and so on. I think that the challenge for the next REF is going to be inspiring confidence in the community that these broader contributions will give institutions an equal opportunity to succeed as those traditional ones, that a data set is just as likely as a journal article to achieve the highest ratings, and that public engagement will be just as valued as a life-saving vaccine. Commitment 2 is around basing assessment primarily on qualitative evaluation, responsibly supported by indicators. And when we look at the REF initial decisions, we can see upfront and central a statement that REF will continue to be based on expert review, informed by indicators where appropriate. So that's a clear match. But of course, there are actually 3 opportunities to go qualitative in research assessment. At the input stage, do the assessors ask for data or do they ask for narratives? At the process stage, is the assessment based on peer review or some kind of quantitative analysis? And at the output stage, is the outcome qualitative or quantitative? And of course, with REF 2028, whilst the input is a hybrid of narratives and outputs and a larger volume of data now, and the process may be 100% peer review, supported to an unknown extent by data, the outcomes of REF are still 100%, maybe 99% quantitative. Words in, numbers out, no qualitative, formative feedback to help institutions improve, only the quantitative, summative judgment. So I think there might be an opportunity to look at that. Commitment 3 is to abandon the inappropriate uses in research assessment of journal and publication metrics based essentially the GIF and the H index. And obviously REF has very publicly banned in 2021 the use of the GIF in the RAF, but they did supply citation indicators to some panels to aid assessment. And whilst there's no specific mention of the use of publication metrics in the initial decisions. The International Advisory Group, as Peter mentioned, did recommend that the exercise should reduce the system-wide focus on classic quantitative bibliometrics in assessing outputs. Now, harnessing the metric tide report, which fed into the REF, didn't go that far, but it did recommend that any data that's used in support of the REF adheres to these community-agreed principles, such as inclusivity and transparency, which would, of course, rule out many of the commercially available bibliometric databases we currently have and have historically used in the REF. And I would say that if the REF is seeking to inspire a broader range of output types, the one thing that would kill that dead in some units is the provision of bibliometric data for journal articles, just showing how well cited they are. Excuse me. Of course, whilst we often focus on abandoning inappropriate metrics in the responsible research assessment space, the one thing that the REF must be applauded for, the initial decisions must be applauded for, is this proactive move to identify more appropriate metrics, with their ambition borrowed from the Harnessing the Metric Tide report to identify data for good in the assessment of people, culture and environment, rightly noting that these should also adhere to standards of responsible research assessment. And finally, commitment 4 is to avoid the use of rankings of research organisations in research assessment. And of course, the REF doesn't use rankings of research organisations, so that's a tick. But as we've already observed, the outcomes of REF are entirely quantitative and therefore entirely rankable. Indeed, the International Advisory Group makes the point very clearly that the REF contributes to competition for rankings in the UK. And whilst the REF is quite clear that they don't provide or condone REF-related rankings, they have retained as a purpose this expanded and rebranded form of benchmarking, now relabelled as Insights into the Health of Research in UK HEIs. And we all know there's a very small step from benchmarking to ranking, which must leave us asking how healthy are the health insights. And I'd love to see the REF embracing some of the learnings in this space about adopting profiles, not rankings, something that KEF does really well, so we can capture those insights without ranking, without creating a further competition. So to conclude, I think the REF Steering Board should be applauded for not only being guided by, but contributing to global moves towards more responsible research assessment, and for making good on their Quora commitments. If I were to make a challenge, I think I'd say that good intentions in research assessment, as I know from experience, can sometimes blind us to unintended consequences. REF clearly seek for this to be a fair and research culture enhancing assessment, but to institutions, this is still a competition with a cash prize. And it will be important to listen to the community's feedback about the potential impacts. And we look forward to engaging continually with the joint funding bodies on both this and future exercises to explore how the REF can further embody the spirit of Quora as they work to achieve its purposes. That's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Very interesting assessment. Marking your homework, Jessica. Now, looking at Slido, it is striking that an issue that we touched on before already, sort of EDI, is being upvoted the most. So we're carrying on getting more and more people upvoting for decoupling outputs has huge EDI implications. What measures will be in place to ensure that institutions submit outputs from a diverse range of staff? And then a specific question from Stephen Conway. Does the removal of a minimum of one output per researcher create a risk that the need to invest in, mentor and support all researchers becomes deprioritized? And let's start with you, Jessica. I mean, I think Stephen tried to answer that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but kind of acknowledging that even if perhaps that was a risk with the knowledge and understanding criterion, you would use the environment criteria to offset these dangers. I think that's the, but Jessica, do you want to just comment, because it's still running strongly?
Yeah, and I'm sure Stephen will want to come in. It is a really, really important point, and we're very interested in hearing observations and thoughts on this. On the one hand, I mean, around things like staff circumstances and some of the issues that have been deeply supportive of diversity, inclusion, recognising what happens in people's lives, we sort of think it's time that institutions take that on themselves and that we don't need to have that as part of the assessment process. If we start putting it back in again, we reverse the decoupling. There are great opportunities in this new design to bring in a wider and more diverse set of people that might come into the purview, or their work to be within the purview of REF, because of outputs being able to come from anywhere, and not restricting it only to those with significant responsibility for research. So there's a win, but there's also, as is being noted, a risk that somehow really helping those people to get over the line by giving them extra time and support, have we removed an incentive there? So I think our best answer to that is that we will want to monitor, actually what institutions actually put forward and make sure that it is a diverse range that comes across the whole family, not just the few very well-resourced professors, for example, putting all their work in and it not being anywhere else. But Stephen may want to add to that, and we do need to think about ways that we can monitor it. We do want to use data, but that will be to some extent in retrospect after the event.
Yeah, not much to add, but just to say this point around the minimum requirement, and I've heard a lot from people about the benefits of that minimum requirement in REF 2021 and the fact that led to resources being used to support researchers across the board in units. That was a rule that we put in place that encouraged that resource distribution. But I'd like to think that, having been through a cycle where that is the case, institutions are actually now clear about the benefits of supporting a diverse array of researchers, and that one of the ways that they will contribute to a positive research culture, which we'll be measuring elsewhere in the exercise, is to continue that practice of supporting researchers to produce top quality research, which has borne dividends in terms of performance in REF 2021. So I think that's an important factor for institutions to take into account when they think about how they distribute resources.
Did you want to add?
Only to say that the REF is not the be-all and end-all. Surely the institutions have a responsibility in their own right to be developing all their own staff. And the measures that are in the REF impact people, culture, and environment, which is really the strategy of the university around people. If the properties are the right properties, you'll pick it up. But I would hope that in the 21st century, every institution in the country doesn't need to be incentivized to be doing this. They should be doing it anyhow.
Elizabeth, anything you want to add?
No, it does feel entirely logical when you hear the arguments like that, but as I say, it does come back to this point that to institutions, this is still a competition. There's quite a lot of money at stake here, and they want to kind of optimise. They will want to optimise, obviously, their submission. And I wonder whether the contribution to knowledge and understanding statement, which is going to make sure that those submissions are representative, is only 5% of the overall submission, and there's 45% resting on those outputs. Is there something around the weighting there that could be done? I'm just thinking out loud here, to make it very clear that equity is still extremely important, because otherwise I think institutions might be tempted to think, well, I'll take the 5% ding and I'll submit all the outputs from those two stellar research groups that we have in that particular unit. I don't know, I just think further thought.
Identify, do either you want to comment on that specific point now, Stephen?
Yeah, well, I suppose that in terms of the weighting, we did say in the initial decisions that the statement would be at least 10% of the contribution to knowledge and understanding. So I think we're open to the idea that it might be higher than that. We think that is a disciplinarily sensitive question. So we want to discuss that with the panels once the panels are in place. So that's a reasonable time down the track. Of course, counter to that, there is already a concern that's been expressed by Geraint earlier today that outputs are now only counting for 45%. So obviously, if we increase that statement, then that puts further downward pressure on the contribution of research outputs.
Can I ask?
But I might just say, just to reflect also that Peter's group did recommend that we looked at an even distribution across the three elements, 33% in each one. So we've already pushed quite a long way from that recommendation.
I would also point out that impact does include an assessment of certain classes of output. So we don't, I think that the knowledge and engagement is not the only production of research. And so I think we're still caught up in the bibliometric mindset about what research produces. It produces policy impact, community impact, business impact. And some of the most impactful work I've ever done was published in the most minor journals you can imagine. That doesn't, and so we need to just be aware that these three dimensions that as Research England or UKRI has produced all intertwine and not as separate as people think.
I'm going to just go back to something else that you said, Stephen, where you talked about strategies and how university strategies. Someone we haven't referred to yet, interesting. Nobody referred to Paul Nurse's recent report. And although it was set up to look at research establishments, he ended up devoting a significant amount of his time and effort to QR and had various observations about how there should be more clarity about how the money goes and that universities should have strategies which related to the use of QR funding. So do you just has Paul's report had any influence on your exercise? And the original doctrine way back of QR was this was originally a compensation to universities for not having endowments of the sort they had in the US. So it was to give universities a degree of discretion and their own pot of money to allocate as they thought best. Have you, in accordance with historic performance, does that doctrine still hold, or are you quite interested in trying to assess what a research strategy is of a university and how it's being delivered?
Yes, I think, in terms of the ref, then I think that, that we already in the environment section and in previous refs have required some statement of future strategy as part of that assessment. I think that assessment has stood alone. It's been evaluated in the ref, but it hasn't really been tied back to either outcomes or indeed past performance. And I think in the ref, in the future, as I said in my remarks, looking at the relationship between those strategic intents that are stated by universities and the output pool which they submit and the case studies that they submit to the exercise could be a really interesting and valuable way of linking those two things together. In terms of future funding strategy, and so I'll put the disclaimer again, this is now a Research England perspective. I'm not speaking for other funding bodies, but we're responding to the recommendation from the Nurse Review around increasing transparency for QR funding. We'll be talking to the sector about that in the future, and I think part of that is we'll be thinking about what the intents are in terms of QR usage and how we might actually monitor that in the future. And I use monitor in a very loose sense. I'm not talking about the bureaucratic process. So I think that is very much on the agenda and does link to some of these changes in the REF. And the funding review that I mentioned, is also consistent with the recommendation from the Nurse Review around looking at end-to-end processes around research funding.
Right. Is there anything you want?
Well, only that the work of the Future Ref programme was completely separate from the work that Paul Nurse did, so and needed to operate in its own dimension. But I think we at Research England certainly have picked up what the report says and want to look at that. But it's a sort of in a separate space really, and I think it's right that research assessment should be considered in a way that it has very thoughtfully and in a global context, rather than perhaps a very UK focused way.
Thank you. Right. Now, finally, as we're running low on time, I think there's not going to, we had so many questions on Slido, but I think there is, the other strand is there's a lot of interest still in this impact and engagement issue that we talked about before. There is, one practical point, just to check with you guys, that the number of impact case studies required will be tied to HESA return in 25 to 27. So someone's asking, will we only hear the number required shortly before submission date? Is that a correct understanding? There's a lot of interest in to what extent active pursuit of engagement has to be shown within every impact case study. So again, to what extent these are different criteria, or they're all related. And also someone asking, what about serendipitous impact that you never planned for? Yes, how is that a poor value, or is that something that we should celebrate? So I think probably, and that is a strong strand. And let me start the other end, because this is also people opportunities to make final remarks. Elizabeth, any observations on impact, and especially with your perspective of the wider commitments to improving research assessment, just how you see impact and engagement?
Well, yeah, not a massive strength of mine around impact and engagement, but one of the things I suppose I've been reflecting on as I've heard the other speakers is something around this kind of link between an institution's research strategy and their submission, and whether there should be a kind of closer link there and that's evidenced. And one thing that often occurs to me is that institutions already, we think about research culture as a completely different separate thing to our, as though it's a new thing that we're all kind of starting to think about now, but we've already got a research culture. Every institution has already got one. And that research culture, to my mind, is embedded in existing KPIs, in existing research KPIs. Should institutions be required to report on those existing KPIs as part of their submission and as evidence of their kind of commitment to research, and perhaps that includes their KPIs around impact, if they have any at all, I don't know. But yeah, just something that we might want to reflect on.
Thank you very much. Yes, Peter?
I think a lot's been said. The one thing that was raised by Geraint at the beginning, which we didn't really focus on so much, was issues of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and cross-boundary research. And I think that when you think about that, that brings knowledge, engagement, and impact in a very intertwined way together. And I think that one of the things that it emphasizes are the processes more than anything else. And I think that that was one of the things we were trying to get across. And I think work will have to be done, obviously, by the groups here on how to report it or measure it. But I would argue that particularly for transdisciplinary research, as opposed to interdisciplinary research, the issues of process and how you engage with the end user right from the beginning, how you do that to have impact, whatever that impact is, whether it's normative or extraordinary impact, is critical. And so I think that one of the big shifts going on around the world is in the understanding that for a certain set of problems in academia, the so-called wicked problems, Mode 2 research is needed, and Mode 2 research needs a different way of being assessed. And of course, the dilemma is you've got one model here to take everything from fundamental particle physics here to remarkable things in the creative sector. So that I think is the key thing that we would like to have had more time to work on. And certainly I think that as the REF proceeds into more detail, and as you already start thinking about what goes on beyond REF 28, because I think we're in a transition here, it's not complete. I think the issues of how Mode 2 research is looked at is really important.
Yeah, yes, that's a very fair point. Stephen, do you want to pick up particularly on the impact? Then I might just ask just about more widely, but that sort of impact and engagement issue.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that we absolutely don't want to exclude serendipitous impact. So there's not, the impact case studies I don't envisage the format for those will change very much, and serendipitous impact has been important in a number of case studies in previous exercises. I think when it comes to engagement, I think what we're seeking to do is to recognise and reward the hard work that goes on in building relationships to enable transdisciplinary research and impact to take place, and also seeking to recognise a wider range of impacts that might not make it into a full impact case study, which is often a highly selective process in many submissions, but to give space for those broader impacts to be recognised. So, I think the intention is not to do something that's very proscriptive and limiting by adding engagement to the mix, but to actually enable more excellent work to be showcased through the exercise. Before I pass on to Jessica, I'll just reassure the HESA geeks in the audience that we are aware of that kind of timing issue at the end of the exercise. Clearly, institutions know their own HESA data before HESA can know it and before we know it. So it should be possible for institutions to know in advance, before we do, how many case studies they'll need. But one thing we are committed to doing is we will publish the software code and the algorithm that we use to calculate the volume measure in advance, so that institutions can plug their own data into that and get answers that they know will be robust, so that the HESA geeks can be reassured.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And now, Jessica, your final observations, and look, it's early days, it's only a few weeks since you produced your proposal, so what have you, give us your reaction to what you've seen so far by way of the comments, and as this is a consultation exercise, how you see the consultation going already, what you learned?
Well, I mean, it's a great conversation that's emerging. It's been a great conversation today. The things that are coming through are not sort of really challenging and asking for a massive change in direction away from something that feels too dangerous to do. I really haven't heard that, and that is very, very positive. And there feels to be a collective commitment to change together, I think. I think where the detailed questions and anxieties come through, it's because the technical design is not yet known, and people are trying to figure out how do they get ready for something that's actually quite a long time away, really. And we sort of want to encourage a kind of collective embracing of the general direction, and the technical bits should fall into place later, and institutions should be managing themselves very well in the way that they do. So it's that tension between those two things, sort of a broad direction that we've now made very clear, and one that we can all get behind, I hope, and then the sort of technical design which will follow. But that's really for a process that's later down the road. We shouldn't be encouraging institutions not to be designing everything around what they think that might look like in precise detail, because that goes totally counter to what particularly Peter was trying to encourage not to happen, this over precision, masses of resources being chased after, kind of an organising effort around something that really we want to be redirected to excellent and great research, and liberating researchers to continue to do that. And you hope that the rest will sort of much more fall into place. Maybe that's very aspirational, but that's the spirit with which we'd like to go forward. I haven't really heard anything that suggests that's not where people want to go. But we do need to watch all the details that are being raised, and it's very, very useful to hear them, and we continue to want to have that dialogue. We won't have thought of everything, even though Stephen is absolutely steeped in this and has thought of most things. We won't have thought of everything. So, I just thank everybody for that, really.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Thank you to all of our panelists for, I think, a really illuminating discussion of these issues. Thank you to our participants online and here, and for putting in such excellent questions on slide here. I'm sorry we had little time for getting them all, but thanks to your panel. And now over to James, for James Wilson.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks to our first panel. My name's James Wilson from the Research Institute here at UCL, and it's my pleasure to be chairing the second half. So let's have a quick handover and bring the second panel up to join us here. Just a reminder on the Slido, there is a separate question to go in on for the second part, if you like. So I can see somewhat dauntingly, we've already got 25 questions online there. And we'll also try and take a few more questions from here in the room. So we're trying to attention to the two sides of a hybrid event. So do go back into part two for new questions, just to make it more easy for us to navigate. Great, so we have another 4 excellent contributors for the second part. We're going to focus in this second half on I suppose the most striking element of the new proposals for REF 2028, the greater emphasis on people, culture and environment that we've already heard a fair bit about from the first panel. And we wanted to try and unpack that a bit more, talk a bit about how the aspirations in the proposed guidelines will be operationalised in different settings in the system. And also, importantly, as Gluckman and others just said in the last session, how the REF, important as it is, takes its place alongside many other imperatives, opportunities, drivers, and indeed obstacles towards creating the kinds of research cultures that we want to see and we want to inhabit in UK higher education. So we've invited 4 superbly well-placed colleagues to reflect on those questions. I'll introduce our 4 speakers quickly now, and then we'll hear some initial thoughts from each of them, just some opening remarks, sort of short interventions, but we will have more time in this session for questions, so do fire in. We're going to hear first from Louise Bracken. Louise is PVC for Research and Knowledge Exchange at Northumbria University, and Northumbria, of course, was striking in its performance in REF 2021, did extremely well. Rees will talk to us about that and some of the ingredients that lay behind that success. We're then going to hear from Diego Baptista. Diego is Head of Research Funding and Equity at Wellcome. And of course, Wellcome is thankfully outside the formal strictures of the REF, but has been playing, does play a very important role in advocacy and in shaping broader aspects of discussions around research culture in the UK. So Diego is going to reflect a bit on some of those connections, I think, in his remarks. We're then going to hear from Simon Hetrick. Simon is a professor at the University of Southampton and is here particularly in his capacity as one of the instigators and the chair of an initiative called the Hidden REF, which some of you will, I'm sure, have encountered in the lead up to REF 2021, a really interesting, novel and I think effective attempt to shine a greater light on bits of the system that were hidden or downplayed in some of the ways in which the REF has operated in the past. So Simon's going to reflect, I guess, on how far the aspirations of the Hidden REF have been realised in the proposals that are now in front of us. And then finally, we're bringing it back home here to UCL, and we're going to hear from Emma Todd, who is Director of Research Culture here at UCL. And we'll talk a bit about how this university is addressing these agendas. So, with that, let's start with Louise.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite. Now, because I am from Northumbria, I can't take any of the credit because I've only been at Northumbria just over 18 months. But I just thought I'd start with a quick look back, because for us, we really used REF as a driver for change. We had a university strategy that was that we wanted to become a research intensive. So REF was brilliant to help us do that. So we set a really grand ambition that we wanted to submit 1,000 members of our staff, publishing at 2-star plus for the REF. Now, some of you, that doesn't sound that many, but that was a change from 2014, that we submitted 343 people, and then we did manage to submit 1,056. So we were really proud of that, but that was a real positive strategy. And then that led to us thinking about staffing differently, thinking about culture, thinking about investment differently. And we were really pleased, and I'm sorry, Lizzie, the rankings were really useful for us because we did have the greatest increase in GPA, in power, and four-star outputs. So it was a really important moment for Northumbria because we could then reflect on whether we met our strategy. It enabled us to think about Northumbria in a different way and articulate who we are. So we really were the university, we feel, that retained and improved access for students from less advantaged backgrounds within a research-intensive university. So that was a really, really important moment for us. And when we then plotted things like our QR power or power against widening participation students, you could really see Northumbria as its own blob, really, which was a really exciting moment. So we were really proud of that. So REF enabled us to do that. The income then followed is almost a reward for that investment. But actually the rankings were really important for us to know ourselves and to be able to evidence that for our strategy, for our staff. And we had success in all of our units of assessment, so it was very much a whole university achievement. And that partly helped us then win the Times Higher University of the Year because we were able to articulate that story. And without REF, I don't think we would have been able to do that, to be fair. So looking forward, we're quite excited about the changes. We again are spending some time to think about what our grand ambition might be for the next REF. We know that we want that to be quality, and we're looking then about how to meet that and how to communicate that to our staff. Because again, that grand ambition for the previous REF was really helpful. It's slightly more difficult now as we're sort of focusing on quality. So I think we're then thinking about the significant research responsibility and the expectation that brings with it in a way. And that's what we will focus on and thinking about people publishing, working, the culture needed to be having quality research at 3-star, 4-star end, both in terms of the outputs, but the impact, the engagement, but also the culture that helps deliver that. And we know our staff volume has continued to increase, which is helpful. We're slightly nervous whether we'll be able to deliver that change in quality, I think, that in GPA, using GPA as that measure, that we are after. Because again, looking at the changes in the rules, thinking about how people might play the game, we want to continue to be able to demonstrate our journey into research intensivity, I suppose. Decoupling, we are on one hand excited about that. It's brilliant for us, I think, to think about being able to celebrate our technicians, for instance, but also people that are moving back from industry. We have a lot of practitioners because of the teaching we do. Think about the huge number of nurses or police we educate. We really want to celebrate their contribution to research, so that's really brilliant. We are also slightly nervous because for us, thinking about research intensivity, thinking about how we've used kind of significant research responsibility, being able to have a quality output has been part of that. So we are worried about maybe the tail and whether they now roll off, but that is a challenge for us about how we manage through our culture, our environment, even through performance management. So we've got to make sure all these things tie up, and we're spending some time to look at that. Research culture, I think, we're finding is really crucial to this next stage of our journey. We have done a lot of changes, and these are things that I can hold my hand up since I've been in Northumbria, where we are changing, becoming more inclusive. We again have just appointed a Dean of Research Culture. We've got an action plan that we're developing with its own KPIs. But we're really looking at some of the fundamentals as well about the formation of our research groups, what they do, how they work. We now have new ways that are transparent funding across the institution, so people know how to access some of that funding to grow ideas, to work together in different ways. So that's really important. So we think these rules and the changes and the slight tweaks are really useful. Even for somebody like us, we think they're really helpful on our journey.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise, very much. I can see Lizzie again. Twitching to come back on rankings, but we will hold that for the questions. We'll turn now to Diego. Diego, you could just talk particularly about how these changes to REF either reinforce, undermine, or interact with broader changes that we are seeing and want to see in the research culture.
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for having me, and it's nice to see everybody. Just to give you a little bit of history about myself, I've worked at Wellcome in open research culture, and now predominantly equity, diversity, inclusion issues. So there's like a golden thread of how do you influence researcher behavior from a funder, right? And these are all what people would call auxiliary issues to research, but to me, they're kind of critical to getting good research done, right? And if you enhance all of these aspects of research, you get much better research in the end. So I'm so pleased to see that people and culture is quite a critical component of REF going forward. It's something that Wellcome has been very interested in for a long time now, and we ourselves are trying to figure out how do we realistically assess this in grant applications or the relationships that we have with institutions. It's really, really difficult, it turns out, and as something that is emergent in actual assessment criteria versus already existing within institutions and people's laboratories, it's really critical that we are iterative with our assessment, right? So we need to try a bunch of things and figure out what works over time. I think it'll be really critical for the folks who are designing this assessment. I know they're going to go through a consultation period, but to be really careful about not only how does this impact those with protected characteristics, I'd argue actually we all have protected characteristics, but how are you platforming those who have protected characteristics that the system is oppressing or the system is systematically excluding from participating in the research, right? It's not only how the system and this exercise will impact those people, but how are you ensuring the needs of those people are met as you're trying to design the system? So as we're going through our consultation period for the next few years, that will be very important. I think another really important aspect of the people and culture elements to ensure that you're not undermining EDI issues that institutions are doing is thinking really critically about how are you actively harnessing the experiences of those within the institutions in a way that isn't reducing quite a rich experience into a single number, right? Peter talked about it a little bit earlier of how we'll be using qualitative and quantitative approaches to doing assessment. And we need to actually spend a lot more time thinking about the qualitative approach, right? How is there a standard in place for institutions to think about culture surveys or to think about harnessing that experience and then using that to feed into the REF? Go in there.
Thank you, David. That's great. Some good points for us to pick up on.
Thank you. So I want to talk about the hidden REF, which started off as a competition to recognise all research outputs and everybody involved in their creation. It started because I was looking for a way of trying to get universities to value research software engineers, which are a new role within academia. And I was looking at the REF, so I thought this is a good approach. We looked at the 2014 REF, had 186,000 research outputs submitted, and when I looked in the software category, there were 38. And obviously this was a big disparity, but it wasn't just the software, it was everything else. All the other 21 categories that aren't related to publications and journal publications and books were being overlooked as we focused almost exclusively on journal publications. And it's gotten to the point where in the 2021 REF, everything that wasn't a journal publication or a book, it was being represented by only 2.4% of all the outputs that were submitted to that exercise. Now, something has to change because ultimately research is based on the hard work of a huge range of diverse different individuals and who fulfill a lot of different research roles. And it's basically, we conduct team research already. We always talk about team research and team science as though it's an aspiration, but we're already doing it. What we're not doing is when it comes to gauging the success of that team, that's the point where we start to narrow our focus and look only at people who author publications and journals. So the reason that this has to change basically is if we don't support everybody who we rely on in research, then if we don't recognize everybody we support, if we don't recognize everybody who we rely on to conduct research, we don't support everybody who we rely on to conduct research, and if we don't support them, then we harm our ability to conduct research. I think the REF in 2028 and some of the initial decisions that are coming out really support this idea of team research, or recognising everybody's contribution. And the thing I'm really interested in is this decoupling, this looking at all staff and not just the academic staff and the contribution that they make. I think that's good policy, but whether that becomes a successful way of pushing research culture in the right direction will entirely depend on the way that it's implemented by the HEIs. We're trying to help them in that approach by just yesterday we launched the 5% manifesto, which is a commitment from HEIs to sign up to submit at least 5% of their research outputs into what we're calling non-traditional categories. So things that aren't publications and books. And we're doing this because we want to push HEIs and indeed the entire research community to look across all of the work we do and value it equally. And if we do that, I believe that we'll end up not only with a more equitable system of research assessment, but also one that is more effective.
Thank you, Simon. And finally, Emma.
Thank you, James. I've been asked to talk about how a university like UCL might align REF 2028 with the broader imperatives towards a healthy, inclusive and sustainable research culture. And I'll touch briefly on 3 ways, because I've been asked to keep to time to save space for questions. 3 ways I believe we can capitalise on the opportunities that REF presents for research culture, as well as mitigating against some of the possible unintended consequences. So the first one is to remain focused on what we already know matters to our research and our research community. REF is a powerful motivating force, and like my fellow panellists, I warmly welcome the increased focus on people, culture and environment. Implementation, of course, will be challenging and likely imperfect, but the changes send a clear and timely message to the sector about what's important. And as Jessica mentioned earlier, it really helps sharpen the focus on how institutions are creating an enabling environment for excellent research. Having said all of that, I do feel strongly that REF should not be what shapes the work that we do on research culture. So following on from the comments that Peter made earlier, and indeed this is not its core purpose as outlined in the recent reports. At UCL, like many of our peers, we've got a good understanding of the conditions that we need to create in order for our research community to do their best work, and the gaps that exist. And we're committed to delivering against a range of priorities in the form of a 10-year roadmap for change. Of course, we will seek out alignment where it makes sense. It would be arrogant to assume we've got nothing to learn from the discussions that are going on in the sector, but I would anticipate more tweaks to our approach rather than a significant change of direction. So we'll continue to deliver the roadmap that we've co-developed with our research community, who continue to oversee the work. Will support delivery of both top-down and grassroots change and improvement, and will draw on UCL's academic expertise in behavioural science, recognising that individual shifts in behaviour, as Diego was referring to earlier, really are the cornerstone of organisational change. And at the same time, we'll actively participate in REF-focused working groups and activity across the institution to inform UCL's response and preparation, as well as to use it as a mechanism to accelerate alignment across faculties and departments, and to improve the data, improve the quality of our data and insights, 2 things that can be particularly challenging in a very large, devolved institution. Secondly, we'll seek to develop meaningful indicators for research culture that inform our strategic decision making, but can also contribute to REF assessments. There's no escaping the need for these measures, or at least some sensible proxies. We need them to know if the work that we're doing is making a difference, and we need them for REF, obviously. So much better if we can develop those in alignment and avoid creating 2 parallel systems. With the consultation on indicators continuing throughout the autumn term, we'll take the opportunity to further develop our emerging and continually evolving measures, and take Stephen up on his invitation to feed those insights into that discussion. So this will involve reviewing existing tools and approaches like CEDAS, the CEDAS survey, which many will be conscious of, aware of, which we've used as a baseline for much of the work that we've done on research culture, as well as looking back at the environment statements from the last REF. And we'll also be developing new behavioural measures with our colleagues in the Centre for Behaviour Change. Finally, before I get called up for time, we'll prioritise collaboration and sharing of learning across the sector. There is a danger, as Lizzie mentioned, of that including research culture so explicitly in the REF, institutions will become more competitive and less collaborative in a space where it's obvious to us all that we need to work together. So getting the indicators right will go some way to mitigating that, but we'll also need to stay true to the values of openness and inclusion that we espouse as an institution, and that includes acknowledging our privileged position and therefore responsibility to the wider sector as one of the larger, more research-intensive universities. So to sum up, in this vein, we'll continue to set aside time and money to collaborate with others, participating in joint projects through bodies such as UKRN, engaging with emerging networks on research culture, and seeking to share not just what has worked for us, but also what perhaps hasn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you all. Very helpful and concise contributions to get us going. We've got half an hour for discussion, and we have now 48 questions on Slido. So we'll take a few of those. We'll start with a couple of those that have risen to the top. Do upvote, whether you're online or here in the room, those questions that you would like to see answered, because that will help push them to the top. But let's also take some here in the room, because I'm very conscious there's lots of you here, and we've got some microphones. So we'll do a couple from Slido and then come back so have your question ready. Picking a couple, and I'll just pass this down the line as it were to see whether any of you want to respond to one or both of these. Two topics that have come up in sort of half a dozen questions near the top. Is it wildly naive to think any REF exercise won't deteriorate into game playing to chase resources? I'm tempted to channel the ghost of David Sweeney at this point and say that one person's, I won't do David's voice, one person's game playing is another person's strategic institutional response. But we get the question. Linked to that, what prevents the decoupling of outputs, feeding a culture of superstars getting support at the expense of other researchers, and a couple further down, every REF creates game playing. What can the REF as an institution do to disincentivize game playing to avoid diminishing its standing in the academic community? So, cluster of questions around game playing. Obviously, we don't now have anyone who's designed the next REF up here on the panel, so we can't, other than as observers, kind of comment on the thinking that lies behind the changes. But it would be good to reflect on whether we think, as a package, and particularly focusing on the people, culture, environment bit, these changes will achieve the kinds of shifts that are intended and envisaged, as we heard from Jessica, Stephen and others this morning. So that's the first question. And the second, linked, and probably a quicker question, a couple of people have asked about the linkages between all of this and other things that are going on in the system. So Chris Hewson has asked about connections between the KE Knowledge Exchange Concordat process, inside the Beltway technical question, but a fair one, between culture, environment and that. And then another question as well on from Andrew McKenzie on connections with the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework. So, Louise, I'm going to start, just work down, you don't have to answer both, but thoughts on either of those?
I'm going to start with the first one, actually, because I was really pleased about what Stephen said, because I think, Northumbria did set a strategy. Some people might say it was game playing, but I think it went deeper than just playing kind of within the rules. It was a driving force. We did in the last REF, the outputs we submitted, they did reflect back onto our composition of staff, particularly around EDI, so we tried to have the right proportion across gender. So I think when Stephen, when you outlined kind of how you think the submission of the outputs maps onto then what we're writing in some of those statements, I was really pleased to see that, because I think that's a really big way for me that I really like that, to see that tie up, because I think that then helps. I think you need to somehow check we are living the stories, I suppose, that we produce. So I was really pleased to hear that, so thank you. On the CAF, I mean, I'm a firm believer that what we do around research culture and to support our staff should feed all of these different ways that we are assessed. There's the core work we do, there's our core aspirations. In a way, I hope we can get to, and this might be slightly new for Northumbria, I know it's maybe not at other institutions I worked at, that the good work we do will feed these different assessments, and that we need to make sure that that's what our aspirations and that our core work actually sets up us to go to do.
Do we still need the CAF though with these bits in the way?
Well, it's measuring quite a lot of different things. You're going to test me now on my technical knowledge, aren't you? It measures something quite different. There is overlap, but it measures all of the ways in which we exchange our wisdom across education and research. It's not just research for a start. And it celebrates almost the range, whereas I think almost in REF we choose to celebrate certain examples of kind of where we've delivered change. So I think they're two different things. I think they should mix, but and again, institutions, you've got different things you want to celebrate, so having them both, I think, actually is really important.
Thanks. Emma?
I'm not nearly as much of an expert on KEF, so I won't go into lots of detail on that, but I will just sort of throw into there another question, which is, if perhaps there's a question about whether we need KEF, do we also need all of the external concordats and drivers that exist? And there are many. And a lot of you will be aware that UK, I think Welcome also involved in the work, and others are looking at how we can rationalise some of that. Internally within UCL, we're looking at how we can work with colleagues. I sit within an office which comprises research, innovation and global engagement. So we'll be working closely with colleagues to rationalise and work out how these things sit alongside one another. Going back to the first question about game playing, I think I somewhat addressed it in my opening comments. It might be somewhat naive to think that we will live up to our values, but I think we should have that intention. We should be held accountable for that. And I think the indicators and engaging and developing those indicators is going to be really critical, so that people can be held accountable for what they said they would do.
Great. Simon?
Well, to start on a wildly naive question, I think the amount of experience now in putting together successive REF exercises means that the team's probably deeply cynical about how much game playing will be played, and probably expecting quite a lot of that to happen. How we prevent that from happening, I think it's going to be really interesting in this next REF, especially with the thing that I'm interested in opening up it to all staff. I can see that one of the later questions is asking about, does this give an opportunity for certain superstar staff to sort of suck up all the resources and be supported? And I can see that would be a real risk. And certainly you've seen this happen in universities in other fields. So I think what the important thing is this next period of discussion and with the research community, whilst we develop the sort of the next, not we, I'm not developing them, but whilst Research England develops the next sort of set of guidelines on how to conduct the REF, because that will be where we can put in things to prevent some of this game playing happening. But we've got to accept it when there are limited resources around. People will fight to get them. On the KEF, I think that's a really interesting one. So I run a team of research software engineers who conduct both research activities and knowledge exchange activities, and we're constantly drawn apart by the KEF and the REF, trying to work out where we're placed and how our work is assessed. So I would actually welcome them coming together a bit more. It would benefit my team significantly. I think probably the reason they're still separate is that the REF on its own is a colossal endeavour. Trying to combine that with trying to judge and knowledge exchange at the same time is probably incredibly difficult. So I could see them coexisting, but yes, I think for now, I would like to move forward.
Diego, finally.
Sure. Y'all are bringing up skeletons from my closet, so on knowledge exchange in general and concordats and how they interact with REF, I think there's actually something quite interesting that Wellcome has worked on with UKRI on how all of the different concordats interact with research culture and enhance research culture by them existing and the processes that they have in place. And what we as funders thought was it'd be really interesting for the concordats to think about how they might harmonize with one another around research culture, and then how that interacts with REF could be really interesting in the future. Whether or not that happens in time is another interesting question. And on whether or not you're naive to think that people won't game it. So I'm a naive optimist, and I think if you set a framework for the outcomes for the game to be inclusive of having a good research culture, or at least having the infrastructure to think about your research culture, gaming that system actually could be quite good, right? You're trying to get people to game a system that ends up bettering the environment that people are working in. But again, I'm an optimist, so I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Diego. Let's take a few questions from here in the room. Anyone who would like to ask something? It can be something that's on the Slido, so feel free. Sarah Main from KC. I see David Sweeney is actually here in person. I didn't need to channel yourself. But, Sarah, there's a mic coming. If you could just introduce yourself when you give your question.
Hi, thank you, James. My name is Sarah Main. I'm the Executive Director of the Campaign for Science and Engineering. My question was on Slido, and it probably wasn't upvoted very much, so sorry for taking the advantage of sticking my hand up. I think the engagement and impact section is really interesting, and I wanted to ask the panel if, and also Research England, if they could say a bit more and think a bit more about how the next REF will really try to assess and value public support for research and innovation. If I may give a bit of context to that, some research and data that we have recently published at CASE, but also other work by HEPI and many other organisations, has shown that whilst there is a high degree of broad public support for science, research and innovation, there are some quite worrying signs. Like if you ask how many people have been to their university recently in the last 6 months, in the last 5 years, it's a very low number. Some of the data that we found shows that people don't think of universities as institutions of research, they think of them as institutions of teaching, and unprompted, if you ask them where is research done, they will say business. They won't come up with universities if you don't prompt that. And most worryingly, almost 2/3 of people across the population will say that they don't think that research and innovation benefits people like them. That's higher for younger age groups. And by younger, I mean almost half the cohort, so up to 44 years of age. So there are lots of kind of other interesting factors in there, like people's conception of what research is quite narrow, so they don't have the breadth of concept of what research and innovation is that we might, and that might contribute to that. So I think there are just a number of signs in data out there from other institutions as well as ours that would say that despite the fact that a huge amount of public engagement goes on from universities outward, there might be merit in thinking about how we actually assess how well that lands with the public communities which the universities are trying to engage, and what the success measures and metrics are for showing that changes are actually happening as a result of that engagement.
Thanks, Sarah. Interesting question. Does anyone want to respond to Simon? We won't go to respond to the Simon. Do you want to take that? Yeah.
Is this working as well? Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting question, because it ties directly into something we've seen, which is that researchers spend actually a lot of their time doing things that aren't other research roles, that isn't directly research in itself. So there's a lot of community building, there's a lot of public engagement. We've got these brilliant activities like Science and Engineering Week that people put a lot of time and effort in an attempt to try and engage with the public, because it's such an important aspect of our work. Yet it's not really recognised beyond getting told, well done, that was a very useful thing to happen. So I think tying these non-traditional sort of research and efforts back into the system is a really important thing to do, because it's only then that universities start to truly value them, when they can see that they're directed to a formal assessment system, rather than it just being something that's run on the back of people with very good intentions and not actually any recognition or reward for doing so.
I just want to make the point that this is quite varies with discipline, doesn't it? I mean, some disciplines would be co-producing their research with the public community. So there's a whole spectrum here, depending on what discipline you're in. How we celebrate that across different disciplines is quite different, I think. So, I mean, for some areas, I mean, if you were doing citizen science or areas of design, the communities and public are integral. Whether they understand that as research, I don't know. But I think we shouldn't assume that they're not included. I think it's quite hard. I mean, I'm now getting into KEF territory rather than REF, is knowing how much of that you do. I mean, and there is that spectrum from the communication about what you do, bringing people in to see what you do, through to that co-production. Knowing where that operates across an institution with a whole range of projects working in really different ways actually is really difficult. And there's something, and Emma mentioned it, about knowing your data and knowing what you do and how you collect that up. And I think that's a big challenge in this space as well.
I mean, Sarah, just turning it back on, I mean, have you got thoughts on how that would be incorporated, within the kind of framework? I mean, obviously the move towards impact itself, in a sense, is designed to orientate activity in a plethora of outward directions.
Well, I suppose
to actually kind of ask researchers themselves to be responsible for changing public opinion in a more diffuse sense seems to me quite a methodologically tall order. But
yeah, I think there are some positive notes, like there's overwhelming data that shows that large numbers of people want to know more about research going on in their local area. So there's appetite. People say they don't know much about research going on in their local area, but they'd love to hear more. And people say that they would like to go, about a third of people say they would like to go to their university for an open day. So, the universities might say we have loads of open days, but they might not know that they're there or they haven't been. So there is, I think, grounds for optimism. I mean, maybe one of the ways that an exercise like REF, which is trying to measure things quantitatively and qualitatively, could make steps forward, is to use some of the sort of more recent examples of measurement of public opinion as tools to just sort of interrogate like how successful the public engagement is, I suppose. I don't know enough detail about how this impact and engagement section will work, but I suppose that's the question I'm asking, is how will it work? Because one might imagine that if it only measures the volume of activity that goes from the university outwards, it might be missing the opportunity to measure how well that activity lands from the public point of view backwards.
Thanks, great. Any more from here in the room? Stephen Curry here.
I'd be interested to get the panel's view on a sort of note I've heard in response to the proposals around the sort of people, culture and environment component, which is now 25%, being considered an input to the system. I think that's mistaken framing, and to borrow a phrase from Ben Goldacre, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because I think culture is in many ways an outcome actually of research assessment practices and of the whole way that the business is run, and that there are aspects of people, culture, environment that are important parts of outputs. So an important output of the research ecosystem is well-trained researchers, people who are bright and innovative, who are team leaders, who are collaborative. And we know from looking at the demographics of our research institutions that they are not yet fully inclusive. We systemically exclude women, we exclude people from ethnic minorities and other people. And so we are not properly searching in the pools of talent that are really out there. And if we really want a highly productive research system, then we absolutely have to pay attention to this. And I'm a little bit concerned that there have been some views expressed that we're just sort of, people are going to play with inputs, and people are going to be, it's all about being politically correct. And I really can't stand that kind of nonsense. And so I think I'd be interested to get the panel's views, and we have a Dean of Research Culture. I think it's really interesting to see that universities are starting to really think deeply about this. So I wonder, I would just like to get a perspective from the panel on that aspect.
David, Wellcome has thought a lot about this question. So
Sure. I mean, fully supportive of that view, right? And I also think it's it's quite interesting how ED&I issues in particular, when they're thought about in processes and systems, become swayed by culture wars per se, right? And some comments are inflammatory and unhelpful for actual systems that need to be built. I don't see a way of realistically assessing people and culture without considering the outputs that we've described, right? Those outputs are actually then input into the system and assessed. Wellcome has done some exercises where we've looked at institutional statements around what you as an institution will do around research culture and what is your strategy. And it's all great. It's great that institutions have websites. We have a website, but actually what you want to do is show your homework, right? What programs and practices have you actually put in place that have impacted a change within your institution? I think it's a huge ask of institutions, and I think we need to kind of like incentivize and prime institutions to do this, and also be patient with them, but it is possible.
Yeah, I guess I just add that in my mind, I think possibly research culture is both an input and an outcome. And we should be looking at it in both ways, not just reducing it to the input. And then I think to address the issue of it being sort of somewhat meaningless, it is very much looking at the cause and effect. And I'll take us back again to the indicators, and it's going to be absolutely crucial to get those right so that we can actually say, you know, this is what we have done, input, and this is what is created. Outcome in terms of research culture on both sides. And I think, I've repeated myself several times to say how important the indicators are, and we actually don't have a lot of time, and I know there's been some work done on it already, but I think probably where we land for this exercise will have to be good enough, and for future exercises or the learning, and what those optimal measures might look like.
Yeah. We'll take a couple more in the room and then we'll go back to online. Sam, back from nature. And then we'll take 2 or 3.
Hi, thanks, James. Sam Masood from Nature. I was just reflecting back on Sarah Main, on your question. And I wonder whether part of the answer is, and sort of extending on some of the changes that were announced, if more people within an institution are now eligible to have their work assessed, technicians and other people who might not perhaps traditionally be considered as researchers, is the sort of the other side of the coin then that the system then values 1-star and 2-star research more than it does right now, and that also applies to funding in terms of the formula, because in terms of strategy, my understanding is that pretty much everyone's aiming for 3 and 4-star. And so yes, 1 and 2-star is measured, but it kind of doesn't really count. And so if we're thinking about that broader inclusion, then there needs to be space and recognition for 1 and 2-star. And that would be the local research that, Sarah, that you talk about, that people want more of.
Great, thanks. We'll hold that and come back to that. Ollie here towards the front.
Should I just ask my question?
You can, yeah, well, do it in the mic so people can hear you online. That's the only reason to do it to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sasha Stern from Hebrew and Jewish Studies. The teaching that we do at UCL, as I think in all universities, is research-led or research-based, which means that a good deal of research is invested into your teaching. And I think it's not unfair to say that a lot of the research that gets invested in teaching doesn't translate elsewhere. In other words, it's never published, or it doesn't, it's not visible in any other ways. So I'm kind of asking why has teaching always been excluded from the REF? It's a kind of hidden REF, isn't it? It's an outcome in a certain way of research which we're not able to report on, or we haven't been able to report on in previous REFs. And I'm just asking, could we put a bit of thought into integrating teaching, or at least the research elements in teaching, into the REF.
Thank you. Yes. Question? And one here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, it's Annette Bramley from the N8 Research Partnership. I just wondered if the panel could comment on the extent to which they feel the changes that have been proposed will support people moving in and out of universities, as UK Arrive indicated that they'd like to see more of that, and also between career paths within universities.
Okay, so sort of mobility between sectors and also between different tracks, academic, professional, para-academic. Louise, let's come back to you. Any opposed?
The teaching one's really interesting because you can submit an education. There is a UA for education. So I think there's a lot of choices we make as institutions about who and how we might want to collect people up and use that part. I mean, it's much more about pedagogy, I suppose, and developments rather than work you do with students. So I would say that is open to institutions. I also would say, obviously you have TEF. I mean, crikey, all these big beasts are complicated enough by themselves. So I'm just going to, that would be my answer about education. We really welcome the changes about mobility across careers. At Northumbria, we have quite a lot of practice-led teaching and education. So we do see people coming back in from industry, and this is really helpful. If your research is slower, I think it helps. We see people that come back and might take on a publication record really quickly, others take more time. So I think that is really helpful that you can feel celebrated as part of this. And I mean, and again, I mean, our technicians are over the moon that they can now be recognised. And I think that they are really, I mean, they're a core part of our delivery of both research and education. So I think that is a really important move. And yeah, definitely our technicians are really excited.
Simon, this is obviously bang on your patch.
And so, of course, it's not just technicians, but it's also like all the research software engineers and librarians and the clinical statisticians. And there's just this, as you work in this area and you start looking for these roles that are important, well, vital but unrecognised, you just keep coming across more and more of these people who are vital but not recognised on publications. So a shift away from a focus entirely on publications, I think, is a really good thing for that mobility that you're talking about. What we've seen with people in my field is they get to the end of their PhD and they've got to choose, so they're going to follow a research career or they're going to follow something that is not quite a research career. And when they're following a not quite a research career, they're not building up that base of publications. So it's kind of like a one-way decision. It's very difficult to get a few years into that new career and then say, no, actually I'm going to go back to being a researcher because you've not got that publication history behind you. So I think the focus on the other outputs and a shift away from that, away from publications, will be a real boon for mobility.
Well, I'm just going to take a few more online now. We'll try and come back if we have time into the room. But I'm just going to try and cluster a few together. We've still got a lot of 67 questions now, of which we've answered about 4. So we won't be doing very well in that assessment. There's several sort of more methodological and sort of questions about the operation of the REF, I guess, which we could kind of cluster together. One, which is very high rated here, UOA panels comprise senior researchers who've benefited from existing toxic and competitive research culture. Are they best placed to assess culture change? And I suppose slightly more constructively, can one assess a research culture without speaking to or consulting with or surveying the researchers that are supposed to, the exercise is geared towards helping? So a sort of methodological question there. There's one other I just spotted that I wanted to pick. Oh yeah, well, a related one again, less pejorative on the panels. How will you ensure that the panels are equipped to understand and assess research culture? So yeah, so some stuff about the mechanics of it, I guess. Any thoughts? Yeah. You have the same issue in Welcome, in funding panels and review processes.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that second question around how can you assess research culture without actually getting a temperature check from the researchers themselves, right? I think it'll be really important for however you're assessing from an institutional perspective, what infrastructure is in place in that institution to do this, right? How are they pulse checking researchers? Not only how they're pulse checking researchers, but how are they using that to inform their direction of travel, right? And the programs that they want to deliver and how they'll put changes in place in that institution. And that's really, really important for this first step in the movement to understanding your researchers' needs and then designing an institution based on that, and it'll get better over time. With the first question, I think that if I'm not wrong, you have plans to increase the panels, right, and include more folks to participate in this. At Welcome, we are taking an effort to increase the diversity of who is on our panels, right, from career stage, background and experience, and geography, and actually that's a really enriching experience for all of the panel members. And the last question was on
it was also on how you train the panels to take account of these issues.
Yeah, so this is one thing that we're also tackling at Welcome, right? How can you give guidance to people where they're not projecting their own experience of their own research culture onto something that they're seeing, right? And the level at which that culture is described is actually really important, and it's important to give good guidance to the institutions for how they report on that, but also have it meaningful enough to actually capture those experiences. It's tough and it'll be experimental.
Yeah, I'll just come in on the second question about whether you can assess research culture without engaging the research community, and I'd firmly say no. We've engaged at UCL, as have peers across the sector, the research community throughout the development of our roadmap, and continue to do that as we deliver it. We've got a community steering group which is a cross-section of the research community that enables us to continue to listen to emerging priorities so that we can shift direction if we need to, but can also feed into the plans and projects that we're wanting to take forward. We absolutely expect to then be engaging them when it comes to assessing if those things are working. I mentioned earlier that we use the CEDIS survey that's run by Vita and is cross-sector, and I believe about 50 universities run that, which provides some useful benchmarking data as well. So you can look not just at your community to see if things are working, but benchmark yourselves against your peers. So yeah, I think firmly from UCL's perspective, it's not something that we would consider doing, and we expect to be asked to provide that information as part of our return.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, I agree with all of that, but I think it's really interesting about how we then take the temperature of researchers and what they think, because we all know our researchers and contribute to research. So, I mean, through CEDAS right now, we've had some really interesting feedback about some of our departments, but they're using that as a channel to raise it anonymously, that we are then looking at more feedback. But again, if you took a temperature across the sector right now, they'd be responding to other things other than research culture. So if we do that, we've just got to think really careful about those complexities.
Could I just add something there? And that's, you know, there are limitations to all data, and in the case of quality data like this, there are, you know, many influences. So, you know, supplementing it with things like focus groups. We've worked in the past with colleagues in our Centre for Behaviour Change to really start to dig beneath the surface as well, to understand, you know, what's really happening. Because sometimes that is also the case. You know, people do say one thing and perhaps mean another, or, you know, that there are various reasons why people don't necessarily tell us the truth. So recognising the limitations of the data we're collecting and not just patting ourselves on the back if it tells us the story we want it to tell.
Great. We're out of time. I'm going to hand back to Geraint in a second. Just before we go, a final one sentence, two sentences. Lots of aspirations in these guidelines for improvements to research culture. Research culture has been a very hot issue, quite rightly, in recent years. For all four of you, what would be the biggest thing by which you will judge the success or failure of these proposals? What will look different if it's worked and what if it hasn't?
I think it will be the tying up for me of the different sections. I mean, I think that, you know, the granularity, I suppose, as well, about thinking that you might have a people, environment, culture section for your UOAs, but actually for your institution, and then tying that with output. I just think you might see us in new ways, and I think it's a really good moment for us to be able to explain ourselves in that way too.
I think for me, if we have been able to use REF to drive meaningful change on an institutional level, but also being able to remain engaged and open and working collaboratively with colleagues to counter that danger I talked about earlier of competition impinging on collaboration, I think that would be a success.
Now, and for me, about 5 years after 2028, I think we would see career paths for all of these hidden roles, these non-traditional roles, and we'd see those career paths actually being populated by people whose value is being understood.
So for me, it'd be about improvement of outcomes of who gets to participate in research, and then who gets to create knowledge, right? And how that knowledge is valued. And then many years down the line, how that increase in who gets to participate in research and the kind of knowledge that's generated impacts society and innovation as a whole.
Great, thanks to you all for questions online here. Sorry we couldn't answer all of them. We're going to hand back now to Geraint Rees, who is going to give some concluding thoughts, but please just join me in thanking again our panel, Louise Bracken, Diego Baptista.
Marvellous. I'm now the only thing standing between you and your sandwich lunch outside there in the Winter Garden. So, 10 panellists, many audience questions, 200 Slido questions, quite a few of them unanswered actually. We're at the end. My brain is almost exploding. But let me just give you a few reflections. I mean, I think the first reflection is that what I've heard is a deep commitment from all of us, all the panellists, everyone who's participated, to research excellence, and a collective commitment to work together and change together. I've also heard that appetite to ask and answer questions, and I've heard a lot of honesty from the panellists, as well as a lot of diverse opinions in the community, some of which, of course, are not exactly aligned. So I think all of that is great. Four other things I'm thinking about in terms of tensions, if you like. Well, let's talk about tensions. I think they're creative tensions that arise because of the complexity of the thing we're trying to maximize. Everyone here and everyone out there online, I suspect, is working from the best intentions to create the best institutions they can, the best outcomes they can, and the best outputs along the way to those outcomes. But tensions arise, right? Well, that's a phrase that Lizzie had about good intentions having unintended consequences. So I heard that tension between the quantitative and the qualitative, that Lizzie was talking about, perhaps the need not to boil it all down to a number at the end of the day and give a formative element to the output that could help institutions improve. But equally, I really appreciated Louise's honesty about how much the rankings have helped Northumbria, which I think gave voice to what many in the audience also feel. So that's one tension. I had a tension about the decoupling. You know, on the one hand, it could be, for example, that an institution is incredibly good at supporting a diverse range of researchers and creating a wonderful research culture. And at the same time, it could be that the outputs that are most likely to be rated 4-star are not uniformly spread throughout that population. But of course, the methods we heard, the sort of Heisenbergian method of then talking about diversity of outputs, might actually have the unintended consequence of not bringing out the best research. So some tension there between the process of measurement and the outcomes we get. I heard that we should be patient, which I think we should, about the technical aspects and the need to design that and not start going off and game playing ourselves as institutions. Equally, I'd point out with sort of wry amusement that we also heard how previous refs have been so influential in changing our behaviour, and it's so important. So we're hearing both that we shouldn't change our behaviours just yet, but we should once we get the results. So a little bit of a tension there. And finally, a tension between the technical work that now needs to be done to actually deliver some of those really important measurements and those things versus the time available. And I was struck by Diego's comment about iterating and about empowering diverse communities and giving them a platform. That's going to be a tension and a challenge for the teams creating that in the time available. Because after all, time is not infinite, and we're now really not too many years away from when we need to finalise our submissions. But wrapping up, what I heard overall was a commitment to openness, dialogue, and working together, which I would absolutely applaud. I saw this as the start of a conversation. That's how I saw Research England colleagues talk about it, rather than the end of one, and part of an iterative process, as Diego was talking about. So congratulations to everyone. I'd like to finish by saying, keep the dialogue going. I think each of us should leave with a commitment to have a positive, open, inclusive dialogue about this to get to the best possible answers we can. Thank you everyone online. A recording will be available. And finally, in answer, I'm going to thank the Foundation for Science and Technology, Research on Research Institute, Research England, all the panelists, our two chairs, and of course, all the wonderful people behind the scenes putting this all together for broadcast and so on. Thank you very much and goodbye.